Well, a sort of history lesson to start with, but recent history. Last week, Russia scoffed at the very idea that it was planning to invade. Now its tanks are on the streets of Ukraine. According to one astonishing estimate, within 12 hours, the Russian army has already sent in 10,000 troops. By now, there will almost certainly be more. It's a blitzkrieg. Britain has imposed sanctions. Germany has canned its Nord Stream 2 pipeline. America is about to react publicly. We'll share that with you as and when we hear anything. The stock market, it's fallen sharply. There are more questions than answers right now. Putin says his troops are there to support separatists in 2 breakaway regions. But will his soldiers go beyond areas currently controlled by pro-Russian forces and start fighting and killing Ukrainian soldiers? How will the Ukrainians, some of them armed with anti-tank weapons supplied by us, by Britain, respond? It is a crisis, but one correctly predicted by Western spies who warned that Putin would use the excuse of helping Russian speakers to send in the heavy armour. A former British military head of NATO said today that this was the most dangerous moment in Europe since the end of World War II. Well, the head of NATO is speaking right now, Jens Stoltenberg. Let's just show you briefly what's happening at NATO. We'll keep across what Jens Stoltenberg has to say, and there in the centre of your frame you can see our economics editor Liam Halligan, who's going to reflect on not just what he's had to say, but a number of other features of the story. I'll also mark your card from 5. We'll be joined by the former Defence Secretary Michael Portillo for his take on events. Liam Halligan, as I say, alongside me to reflect on different aspects of this, Liam, not least the economic impact. Where are we?
Well, Russia's obviously one of the world's biggest energy exporters. It supplies Europe with 40% of its natural gas. The world's biggest wheat exporter as well. So as Western leaders have moved to put sanctions on Russia, they will have kept in mind our own cost of living crisis, the fact that a lot of families here in the UK are trying to beat the squeeze as petrol and diesel prices go up. And I must say, Colin, my overwhelming response to these sanctions is that they're pretty tepid. Financial markets seemed a lot more scared of what was going to happen this morning than what actually happened in terms of sanctions this afternoon. Yes, wholesale gas prices are elevated. You're going to see petrol and diesel go up even more on the forecourts over the next couple of days because those oil majors, they're never slow to ramp their prices up, are they? Especially on motorways, as GBNews viewers often tell me. But actually, the sanctions so far, they're pretty limp. And so financial markets haven't responded with as much turbulence as you might have thought.
I'm going to see if I can wave a magic wand and try and do something about this white line that's separating us. We've seen Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary-General of NATO.
Colin.
He can go, so we can actually have a proper conversation. There we go. Thank goodness. The technology sometimes gets in the way, as hinders as well as helps. I was really keen that you come in today, not least because, actually, you lived in Moscow. You've got a perspective on the Russian mindset that very few of us have. I was going to say happier times then, more relaxed times in a sense. But as you look at what's happening, and there was that extraordinary speech from the Prime Minister, our Prime Minister today, talking about the absurd mysticism that Putin's been using recently, talking about Ukraine being part of the greater Russia and all that stuff. That sense of Mother Russia and this mystical idea, what on earth does he mean by that?
It reminded me of Churchill. I'm sure that was no coincidence coming from the lips of Boris Johnson, of course, our great wartime leader, talking about Russia being a riddle inside an enigma wrapped in a mystery. Yeah, I lived in Moscow in the 90s. It's where I cut my journalistic teeth as a foreign correspondent. I lived there again in the noughties, as we must learn to call them. And so I've kind of steeped in the Russia story, spent a lot of my adult life covering and writing and reading about Russia and talking to lots of Russian and Ukrainian people. And I think it is true to say that there is a real closeness, a real affinity between the Russians and particularly East Ukraine. East Ukraine, east of the Dnieper, basically Ukraine's a country divided by a river. Kiev is right in the middle. The Dnieper goes through the middle of Ukraine. To the east of that, broadly speaking, it's Russian speaking. And to the west of that, it's Ukrainian speaking, a part of the world that over the years has been part of Poland. It's part of a Slavic sphere of influence, but a different sphere of influence. And I think for a lot of Russian people, East Ukraine does feel like at least somewhere that has affinity with Russia. The great irony here is, Colin, that Khrushchev, the Soviet Cold War leader, the guy who banged the shoe on the desk and said, "We will bury you," who faced up against John F. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, probably the only post-war moment that can be comparable to what we're currently living through. This is a serious situation, though. There's no nuclear weapons being wielded at this point. But Khrushchev was a Ukrainian. There was a real closeness between Russia and Ukraine during the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, the late 80s, the early 90s, Ukraine became independent. And since then, those two halves of Ukraine, the Polish facing, EU facing, if you like, though the EU will never let them in. They're a bit too good at agriculture. Those Ukrainians would wind up the French and others. And the eastern part of Ukraine, the Russian-speaking part, I wouldn't say they felt like two countries, because there is a very strong Ukrainian national identity. And in better times, there is a feeling of national unity. I've been in Ukraine on National Unity Day, and it's quite a thing. But they do have different perspectives about Russia's intentions. And now we're seeing those two perspectives being blown apart.
And there's even, I suppose, there's a religious divide as well. More
the Catholic
side on the West and the Orthodox,
the Russian Orthodox Church
on the right.
Too.
I'm just here. We are watching what Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, is saying. He's talked about sanctions. That's to be expected. He said, I think the exact quote is something along the lines of, "It's never too late to stop your attack." An invitation for the Russians to wind things back, wind their neck in, reverse the tanks, reverse the direction of travel today that we've seen. I'm also reading that the Russian president has asked the country's parliament for permission to use military force outside the country. Liam Halligan, he's pretending to be a full-throated Democrat. We all buy that, don't we?
I mean, the Russian parliament has some power, but not a lot of power when it comes to what the president wants. It is very much a presidential system, unlike ours. What I've been trying to focus on today and during my On the Money show, and we'll do more tomorrow at 1 p.m. lunchtime, is the implications. If you're sitting at home in the UK, this seems like two blokes in a TV studio wanging on about Khrushchev and history. Actually, this does have a really big implication for this cost of living crisis in terms of fuel prices, in terms of food prices, Colin. Russia's the world's biggest wheat exporter. Russia has put a ban on exports from Russia of something called potassium nitrate. What's that?
Fertiliser.
Fertiliser, exactly. And so lots of farmers I know are texting me, I live out in the country, what's happening in Russia, Ukraine? Because I need to know what fertiliser prices are going to be in 3 or 6 months' time, because I need to make an order. This is a big part of my cost base, as it is for many farmers here in the West. So, yes, there's lots of reasons why our Western leaders will want to impose sanctions on Ukraine, on Russia at the moment, because of this escalation in tensions with Ukraine. But they will have in the back of their mind, or even in the front of the mind, the implications on the cost of living crisis here in the West, on the implications for their voters.
Liam, want to talk some more about the cost of living crisis, but we'll save that for after our next item. But for now, thanks very much indeed.